Welcome to City University of Seattle's doctoral residency. In this module, we're going to explore research methods. Now, this is more of a cursory overview, and more specific research methodology, if you have been taking the research courses, will be in your research uh, core courses, namely the qualitative and quantitative course. But this module is more of an overview to tie in together the concept of research methodology and what to expect in chapter 3 of your dissertation. Now, I love this picture because we have the control group on one side and then the out of control group in another. And so this is more of an experimental design, but I found it humorous to find, this picture online about what's a control group and what's the out of control group or the non-controlled group. All right, in this session, we're going to review the concept of research methodology and explore the concepts and characteristics of quantitative and qualitative methods, really the two major strains, if you will, of research. We'll also highlight the content of chapter 3 of the dissertation and talk a little bit about that process. Now, the first set of slides, I'm going to talk more about the philosophy and understanding research as a concept. And this might not be of great interest to some of you, but I think it's good framing to understand and think about research, because as you are thinking about the methodology you're choosing, remember that the methodology you choose stems directly from your research questions, which stem directly from your purpose statement, that stems directly from your problem statement. So everything is aligned. What we're talking about now is the specific way of thinking about how you're going to collect your data, and does your research answer the questions or questions that you have in your study. Now, research generally involves the following, and these are words more philosophical, of ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Ontology is the way we view ourselves. It's a theory of being. Epistemology is how do we understand knowledge? How do we know what we know, including how the fact that knowledge is even acquired. And methodology specifically is how we do things. Now this chart, and I don't know if you can see it here, but you can download this presentation and pause it and take a look. It's a great chart because it's talking about the philosophy of research, and again, splits between two major themes, what's called post-positivistic qualitative traditions, which is on the right-hand side. Then the left-hand side is positivistic. So just know that regardless of it's quantitative or qualitative, you're in a research tradition, whether it's positivistic and post-positivistic. The main point is that sort of two-thirds down here, almost the third from the bottom, positivistic or quantitative traditions typically use statistical methods to analyze data, whereas post-positivistic or qualitative traditions use analytical induction to analyze data. Usually, quantitative traditions use statistical inference procedures. They use a sample, whereas the post-positivistic or qualitative traditions generalize their case findings by searching for similar cases. They interpret stuff. They describe stuff on the left hand. They interpret stuff on the right side. So again, just a more philosophical chart that gives you the background of research. Interesting nonetheless. But let's talk specifically about quantitative, the quantitative tradition. Quantitative being numbers focused. And let me just say here that many students approach their dissertation saying that I just want to do a qualitative study because I'm not good with statistics. Well, that's great, but you know what? Let's base it on your research question and what's the best way to get your data from your research questions, which again stem from the purpose and problem statement. So don't rule out quantitative just because you're a qualitative person, and vice versa. Don't rule out qualitative if you are a high-level statistical type person. It's going to be based on your problem ultimately. So let's just explore, again, cursory detail or cursory overview of quantitative and qualitative. Here's quantitative. It's based on the assumption that reality is independent of its observers. How do we obtain knowledge that is objective? What we seek to examine in quantitative traditions, it's the connection between stuff, between observable phenomenon and causal relationships. So what is given? How do we explain that? We observe some phenomena in the world about your topic, for example, and we want to figure out relationship. Are there causal relationships? What's the connection? How do we explain it? That's what quantitative traditions philosophically go toward. Logic and math are the hallmarks of the analytical approach. They're not subject to sensory illusions, meaning that the data says, and so what it is what you get is what it is. You can't, you know, explain the number two. You have to just take it for what it is. Data is data, at least numerically. Logic from results from logic and math analysis are universal. They don't change. The number two here in Seattle is the same as the number two in New York. The only results that are precise and are not subjective are those that can be formulated in math terms using calculations and measurements. So everything boils down to the equation. It's either it is or it is not. Now, quantitative methods have a hypothesis. This is important because if you have a qualitative study and you say I hypothesize anywhere in there, you're really doing a quantitative method. So the hypothesis is a proposition, a condition, a principle which is assumed without belief in order to draw out logical consequences, and by this method to test its accord with the facts which are known or may be determined. The whole point is that a hypothesis you can think of as a hunch. I believe that this. The hypothesis is that leaders at X do not have an effect on employee behavior. The hypothesis is using integrated marketing strategies at a sporting event do not produce revenue. Whatever it is, it's a statement of definitive fact or not. So you're going to test it. That's essentially what the quantitative method is. It includes statements of possible factual patterns. Perhaps it's a statement about relationship. An assumption or group of factors determines the emergence of another. In other words, there's factors involved, and it's either it is or it isn't. For example, a person's early childhood experiences are an important factor in determining the adult's personality. Okay, it either is or it's not. And the quantitative method is going to just test one aspect of this, if it is or it's not. Now, you have this H with a funny zero after it. That's called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a prediction that no relationship between two variables will be found. We'll get into what variables are in a bit, but essentially, null hypothesis says that nothing happens. No difference. No relationship, no difference, no significance, nothing. That's the null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis, again, this is in logic, has the H with a little 1 under it there, next to it. The alternative hypothesis is that a proposition that is accepted in the null hypothesis. So in other words, if the null hypothesis is not correct, that means you accept the alternative hypothesis. It's either 1 or a 0. That's it. Pretty straightforward. Now, a couple things with hypothesis, or hypotheses specifically, more accurately. There's a thing called a directional hypothesis. This is saying that group A is better than group B when you apply this test, for example. This is different from a non-directional hypothesis, which says group A is different than group B in the same test. So group A in the directional hypothesis assumes that it has some direction, whereas non-direction, it just means there's difference. So anytime you have difference and you're not comparative, making any comparison, that's non-directional. If you're attaching inequalities, it is better, worse, or about the same, that's a directional hypothesis. And again, I know a lot of this is philosophical, but this gets you conceptually what you're thinking about, because it's important to think about why you're doing what you're doing to address the questions in a quantitative study. Now, variables. You have two variables. You have a thing called the independent variable, and you have the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is what the researcher wishes to explain. The independent variable is the one that's expected to explain the change. So it's the one that's explored, it's the one that causes the change, it's the one that is the expected outcome of the dependent variable is the expected outcome of the independent variable. In other words, You have your independent variable, and you can do left and right, or up and down, whatever. The dependent variable is the result. Independent variables can be manipulated, or they are the ones that you can choose, and the dependent variable you can think of as the result of manipulating the independent variable. Your focus is on the dependent variable, and so that's your question. It's tied into the question, whereas the independent variable is how you get to that question, is how you can think of it. So quantitative methods focus on math models because they do. Statistics are heavily used, and there's different kinds of statistical models. There's descriptive statistics, which explain and organize a set of data. So for example, the mean, the median, those are descriptive statistics. The N, how many participants were in your study, those are descriptive statistics. Now you have types of statistics that are different than descriptive, that are measures of central tendency. So this is a single numerical value that is used to describe the average of the set of scores. So the mean, again, measures of central tendency, whereas measures of variability are different. The amount of dispersion among scores, so variance, standard deviation. How much does this score, that data set, that number, how it varies from the mean, that's a measure of variability. Okay? So when we get into things like ANOVAs, t-tests, standard deviations, those are measures of variability. That's different than number of participants, number of respondents, etc. Those are two different types of statistics, and it's important just to keep that distinction, be aware of that distinction. Now with a thing called a fixed design, these are non-experimental strategies. Typically these are surveys. So the overall approach is the same as the experimental strategy, but the research, and an experimental strategy, by the way, has a is where you see a lot in, say, pharmaceuticals. Survey is a type of research, but the researcher does not change the situation, circumstances, or experience. There's no control group, for example. There's just one group or two groups, and you're just doing a survey and you're getting data from that. Sometimes a sample is known. Instead of sending the survey out to the whole world, you just do a sample. Polling data, classic example of survey methodology. It's a measurement on a small number of variables. You're not measuring 3 or 4 different things. You're just measuring a certain aspect of a condition. It may or may not be involved in hypothesis testing. Straightforward design, survey methodology. Little story here is I originally wanted to do a survey methodology, and this is a story about choosing your methodology over your question. When I did my dissertation, I thought, hey, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to get it done. I'm going to get 1,000 respondents, write it up, and I'm going to write it, and that's fine. But what I found out was I didn't know what my question was. And as I dug deeper into the research, survey methodology wouldn't work. In fact, survey methodology, I was thinking of it backwards. The key was my dissertation chair said, what's your question? What's your problem? What's going on? Don't worry about your methodology, because your question will lead itself to the type of methodology you use. He was right. I ultimately ended up doing a phenomenological study of 15 respondents, and it was great. Qualitative, completely different than what I had originally wanted to do, a quantitative study, because I wanted to finish faster. In fact, I finished faster because I did the qualitative method, because I knew what my question was. So, qualitative. I love this tradition, and I've come to love this tradition, and I really appreciate the qualitative method because it is about words. Your data are not numbers, your data are words. Now, qualitative research, it's a multi-method in its focus. It involves interpretive, naturalistic approaches to the subject, whatever that topic is. This means that qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings. They try to make sense of things or interpret things or meanings that people bring to them. So you see that they're a little different. They're focused on meaning. They're focused on interpreting something. Why? Why does it do this? Versus in a quantitative method, it's what is it? It's either this or it's that. Qualitative is a little bit more flavor. So it's like black and white versus color TV. It's the same story, except there's some differences in the nuances. That's not to say quantitative methods have nuances. It's pretty straightforward with quantitative methods. Whereas in qualitative methods, you're focusing on the more sense of meaning, natural setting, and again, primarily words. Components of qualitative research design is what's the goal of the study? What do you intend to illuminate? What will it influence? Why do you want to investigate it? Why should we even care? And why is it even worth studying? So think about these purposes, why you're doing the research first before you do qualitative designs. And the concept behind qualitative design is what do you think is going on? Not what you think the answer is, but you might have a hunch. Well, this is good. Educators use a lot of both designs, in fact, but explaining, phenomena that happens, what theories will guide you, what literature will you review, what experience will you draw on. So you can see it's a lot more uh, making meaning of the world, using experience, etc. But it is a research tradition, and so it's not saying that the evidence is there or not. The evidence is going to be your words. Okay, the research questions are not a hypothesis. So the research questions really allude to what you want to understand. What do you not know about something you're studying? What do you hope to learn about this, thing, this subject, this topic, the problem? What questions do you expect to answer, and how are the questions related to each other? So there's a lot more relationship and nuance in qualitative traditions. Methods, what are you going to do in conducting the study? What approaches and techniques will you use to analyze your data? Think about validity, and specifically, the word is transferability in qualitative designs. How might you be wrong? Are there other explanations for it? Why should we even believe you, and who can use this research? I want to share a story here of I was in a school district meeting a few years back, and one of the school district administrators were presenting data on why we should close certain schools. Um, and the school district official was talking about test scores. And as you see from the test scores, A, B, and C, we need to close this because, first of all, we don't have enough students and the students aren't doing well. Well, many of the audience got upset because they had stories to talk about. They had anecdotes. And the sad part about it is the school official said, well, if it's not hard data, we don't count it. Those are great stories. Well, I would differ. I would say that the stories and the emotion, that is data. And if a researcher discounts that data altogether, I think you're being one-sided. This is why mixed method approaches do a great thing. Mixed method approaches do both the quantitative and qualitative, but again, it's going to be a lot more complex. And the whole key to this is you want to finish your dissertation. So just know that data is both words and it is numbers. Now, a type of strategy is a case study in qualitative designs. A case study is the development of a detailed, intensive knowledge about a single case. Sometimes it's two cases, two or more cases. Um, uh, it's the case in context. There's a wide range of data collection techniques here in case study, so it's not just interviewing participants, but in any case study design, one must also include observations, not just the interviews, and document analysis or artifacts. So you're building a profile, a case. What's the evidence about the case that you're going to explain? So remember, case study is not just interviews, it must include other sources of data, artifacts, documents that attest to your study. Ethnography is something we don't use a bit, but I wanted to include here. It seeks to capture, interpret, and explain how a group, organization, or community live and make sense of the world. Ethnography is like a self-autobiography, which is an autoethnography, a data set of one. We probably won't allow, just a data set of one. What's my interpretation of the world? We'd like a little bit more robust data, but just know that it is a tradition. It's immersion of the researcher in that setting. Observations are critical to this. I'm not saying that we don't, but we highly discourage you from doing ethnography because, especially if it's just pure observations, then where's your data set? We'd prefer something more. If you're going to do something like that, maybe a case study. Use ethnography, participant observations to add to the data set of interviews. So that's just a type of research tradition, ethnography. Grounded theory is another one. Grounded theory actually had a dissertation that used grounded theory in it. This is a great one, in fact. Grounded theory seeks to generate a theory from the data, and it can be applicable to a wide variety of phenomena. And typically it's interview based, but a flexible strategy which provides prescriptions for analysis and theory generation. So the whole concept of grounded theory is that a researcher will get data from interviews and then go back and look at the theory and see that, I don't have enough yet. I need to interview more. So there's a point at which there's not a fixed amount that you say that by then I have interviewed all I can, and now I have a theory. So there's in other words, what I'm saying is there's not a fixed number of interviews you do and then you have your theory. You just keep on going until you can't go anymore. So it's like running as far as you can, and then when you drop dead, then you're done. That's grounded theory in essence. You're going to keep on doing interviews, more interviews, and then go to the literature, more interviews and more interviews. Have you come to some conclusion? No, do more interviews then. So it can go on and on. Grounded theory, when it's done, is great, but during the process, it can be arduous, just to let you know. Some other qualitative research traditions are phenomenology. This is what I used. I loved phenomenology because it's helping explain reality as it appears to the individual. So every individual had their perception of reality. I had 15, and so I wanted to combine those together, and was there something going on? There was something going on. They observed something in common. There was something in common that was happening that we're trying to explain. That's phenomenology. Hermeneutics is a type of phenomenology. It's the process by which individuals arrive at the meaning of a text. So how do they actually arrive at the meaning? More so than what's the aggregate phenomenon going on. Then there's narrative analysis, which is organized representation and explanation of the human experience. Narrative analysis is focused on words and why they said words and why they said words and maybe the tone, the expression, all that different stuff, studying just the words that are used itself. So going into specifics here, but know that there's different research traditions, and your main two breaks are quantitative and qualitative, and of course mixed methods as a third, which I want to mention. It's the most challenging type of methodology. In essence, you're doing two studies. You focus on combining both quantitative and qualitative methods. Now, the challenges are that there's extensive data collection, and it's very time intensive in studying both the text and the numerical data. So you kind of have to be good at both in order to do mixed methods. But again, not saying you should or you shouldn't, but if your research questions and purpose and problem statements align and it's what you need to do, then do a mixed method study. It's just going to take a lot longer. You need to consider the timing, a thing called being phased or concurrent, meaning that in a mixed methods design, you could either do them phased by doing, let's say, your qualitative first, and then your quantitative next, or vice versa, or you can do them concurrently. You're taking your data, you're getting a data sample, and you're doing interviews, for example. Think about weighting. What's the priority? Is it given to the qualitative or quantitative? And then mixing. How are you going to interpret the data? Are you going to integrate the data that you have from the quantitative and qualitative? Are you going to connect them? Is it going to be embedded with each other? So there's a lot more complexity in it. It's not 3D, it's like 4D. So mixed methods, again, it's a great design, but it's quite complex. Think about some strategies here. So here's a couple of strategies for mixed methods design. There's a thing called the sequential explanatory strategy. And if you have a tendency toward quantitative analysis, you do quantitative data collection and numbers and all that stuff first, and then you do qualitative data collection that helps explain stuff about your numbers. Well, there's the contrast to this is sequential exploratory strategy, where you have tendency toward qualitative design. So you do your interviews and get your data that way first, and then you analyze it and follow it by quantitative. So it helps explore further some stuff. So, a little difference in nuance, but the strategy is you're doing them sequentially in certain orders. So I'm going to give you some examples. And again, I didn't cover the specific types of tests you use because there are so many. So simple ones obviously are quantitative and qualitative, but there's things called parametric tests. There are ANOVAs, there's MANOVAs, um, chi-squares, Cronbach's alpha, all the different quantitative terms you can choose. We could talk about research traditions in grounded theory, phenomenology, hermeneutics, go into case study. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you will work with your chair in determining the best method of choosing to address your research questions, and know that you also have a director of research who is an expert in this here at CityU. So rely on those people quite a bit. So in the brief time we have remaining, I want to talk about just some examples or share some examples of having you choose the method. Now, again, simple, but the point is that it's iterative and you're going to be talking about this as you write your work. But here's an example. Luke wants to know the preference of technology use in education amongst adolescents, young adult, middle adult, and late adulthood. What's the research design, do you think, Luke? Oh, sorry, change that. Should be descriptive, correlational, qualitative. What I'm going to do is allow you to pause and then continue on. So feel free to pause anytime, and then we'll continue on with the answer. Okay, so the examples that I give you, not just one answer is applicable, more than one can work. So Luke wants to know the preference of technology use in education amongst adolescents, young adult, middle adult, and late adulthood. The research design of the study would be, it could be a correlational study. Luke could study correlation between the preference in each group. It can be a qualitative study. So you see, we've not narrowed, because your purpose statement is directional or it has a certain aspect, does not mean you are tied to a certain methodology. You can choose different methodologies to answer your question. Choose the one that best aligns. Okay, so you can choose correlational or qualitative. Qualitative, you can go with a grounded theory, you can go with a phenomenology, you can even go for a case study on here. Any of those traditions would work. Okay, Leah desires to know about how conflict management is handled by managers of union-based organizations. Could it be correlational? Could it be case study, quantitative, and phenomenology? How conflict is handled? I'm going to pause, and then you could discuss this, think about it, and then I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, how conflict management? Why is it not correlational? Because there's no two groups mentioned. If there were, manager A and manager B, managers of unions versus non-unions, maybe you can do a correlational study. How come it can't be quantitative? Well, quantitative, there's nothing about how conflict is handled. How do you measure conflict? Perhaps there is. I think, choose the best example. It doesn't have to be, but a case study and phenomenology could happen here. How about the three? Finn wants to know about the cause and effect relationship between teaching methods and student success as defined by results of a beginning of the year and end of the year analysis in two separate groups. Descriptive, quasi-experimental, quantitative, or qualitative? Well, I'll pause. Okay, can't be descriptive. Descriptive just kind of gets to the cursory type of things. Descriptive just describes. Whenever you say cause and effect relationship, you're not just describing, you want to find out more about something. So that's what descriptive essentially means. Quasi-experimental is you have a control group and you have a out of control or a non-control group. Well, so a descriptive or quasi-experimental may not work in this. Quantitative, yeah, you can find some data in terms of cause and effect relationships and teaching methods, student success. Maybe there's test scores you could use. Beginning of the year test scores in the student groups in the beginning and end of the year test scores, for example. Perhaps you can do a qualitative method and find out how people felt about this. Did this cause this? Are they related between the teaching? Are the teaching methods related to student success? Maybe you can interview the teachers. Maybe you can interview the students. Whatever it is, you can take two different traditions. Okay, so again, I just wanted to, let me go back. I just wanted to show you more thinking around this, and because your topic is going to be so detailed, I don't have examples to show you, but the great thing you can do is you could look at different dissertations from CityU and other dissertations, take a look and ask the questions, why did they use this design for this? And what was their research question? That's the whole point to this, okay? So at the same time, whatever research tradition you use, you want to back that thing up. You want to be able to justify why you're using what you did. So I have some books and resources for whatever tradition in the qualitative sense. Cresswell and Patton are great. We use Patton as a book in our text. Yin's a great study for case study. Vagal, phenomenology. Shermaz for grounded theory. Narrative research, ethnography, whatever it is, you make sure you have a textbook to refer to it and how you're using it. In quantitative research, Salkind, Statistics for People Who Think They Hate Statistics, is a great text. Survey, Fowler, Survey Research Methods. I love surveys. Again, I was going to do a survey originally, but chose to do qualitative instead. So survey methodology, know that Fowler is a great resource for you. So let me go on to the second part of this presentation, is talking about Chapter 3. And I'll go through this rather quickly because we'll be working more of this as you work with your chairs. But in Chapter 3, that's the methodology section. And remember that Chapter 1 is your introduction to the dissertation, and Chapter 2 is the lit review. Different from a review of the literature, remember. Chapter 1 is the place where you introduce your problem and the purposes, a little background of your study. And Chapter 2 is an overview of the field. It is the case. It's the argument for doing your study. It's the rationale why you chose the methods, and then it also includes your research questions. Now, Chapter 3 is your methodology section. And how does it look like? What does it look like? Well, Chapter 3, like Chapter 1 and 2, has a summary of what's been covered so far, transitions from an introduction and lit review to now discussion of the methods of how you're going to do this thing. And now Chapter 3 is a high level. And you'll go more in detail, but at the start, you open up with a high level overview, conducting a survey, for example, to address the research questions. Here's how I intend to do it. So that's the start of Chapter 3, the introduction, because you're going to go into further detail. For example, your participants. This is going to be a section. Participants. Who's going to be involved? How will you gain access to the participants? How do you maintain proper research procedures and ethical protocols? How do you make sure that the people can opt out if they want to? Will you need informed consent? Yes, you will need informed consent. That has to be included in a section of that. And think of these as headers now, headings in Chapter 3. Informed consent, by the way, is if you need to access them or have their guardian's permission, you need informed consent. It applies if the participants are members of a protected population, if they can be identified, if you're using data that's specific to a participant. It is an issue for IRB. So know that as you work with your chair, think about confidentiality, and if you're using data from protected populations, for example, children, folks with criminal records, just know that there are things that you have to think about with the population, and IRB, the Institutional Review Board here at CityU, will mention that. So what is IRB, by the way? It's a group of faculty from across the institution that know the law. IRB, in essence, protects you, and it protects CityU from damages that could occur. In essence, it protects you. Saying that the IRB committee is the one that clears the way for you to ensure that you're not doing anything unethical, that stuff can be identified, ensures confidentiality. In essence, it meets all legal and ethical standards for research. All dissertations have to be cleared with IRB, and you cannot collect any data before IRB approval. It is a violation of ethical standards. All doctoral students have to complete this thing called the CITI certification and submit that certificate prior to the IRB. So you do the CityU training, and then you do a thing called a CITI certification. You read stuff online, you answer questions, and you're certified. But then you still have to go through IRB. So now more on the participants. What's the population? The sampling method. How are you going to sample them? Is it purposeful, snowball? Is it random? Uh, how do you defend the sample size? How do you know that the sample size is accurate for your research? Will the results of the sample be generalized to the larger population? And then again, in confidentiality, how are you going to make sure that they're confident? Will you confident? How are you going to make sure that you cannot identify the participants? Perhaps you use initials, perhaps you use a pseudonym. Many qualitative interviews use a pseudonym. That's a great way to do it. You got to talk about the instruments, the surveys, the questionnaires, the name of the instrument. Maybe it's the Myers-Briggs Temperament Index. Maybe it's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Index. I don't know, whatever it is, choose the instrument. Maybe it's the Leadership Practices Inventory. That's been one that's used. What does it measure? How is it valid? Is it reliable? How were scores calculated using this instrument? Is it collated? Is it aggregate? Whatever it is, you have to describe the instrument that is being used and why you're using it. What processes are needed? Is it something that is complex that you need approval from? Do you have to adjust this instrument for your particular study? In other words, did you contextualize it? How did you get permission to use this instrument? And how do you collect the data? Again, all these different questions, you have to address them in your chapter 3. Note on, if there's a tool, use one. Use one, and if it fits, don't force it to fit. So use an existing tool if there is one, and also use an existing tool if it fits. Don't just think, hey, I can kind of use some of these questions on the survey. That's not what the survey was meant to do. Or this assessment tool. Oh, I like this. This is in there. No, don't just pick and choose. Don't force it to fit if it doesn't fit. It has to fit if you're going to use some sort of assessment instrument. Make sure you have validated. In other words, have other researchers use this tool for a similar question, a similar study. You might need to get permission to use this tool. Describe this tool as part of your literature review and the theoretical research behind its creation, and provide enough information for study replication. Now, with the specific research method, and this is where there's a myriad of them, you have to identify and justify the use of a method. Quantitative, qualitative, mixed mode. Why are you doing that? This is where you want to cite the literature to show the rationale for the selection of methods. Again, go to Cresswell, Patton, Salkin, Fowler, Yin, Sharmaz. Those are all great authors to cite when you're talking about your research methods. Now the design specifically is the specific tradition you're going to use. Why do you select phenomenology? Why do you select? Why do you not select it? How's it going to help you answer your question or address your problem? One of the most common forms of error that we see in research design, especially in the chapter, is overreach. That this tool is used, the survey instrument is used, but then they're going to get some qualitative data. Well, no, just use the survey for what it was meant. The second thing is it's a mismatch. It's not the right tool to use. It's not the right tradition to approach it. Let's say you're just going to do interviews, but the question warrants more interviews and documents. Well, make sure that your data set aligns with the research tradition you choose. Once you get your data, you need to analyze it. And so in chapter 3, you're going to talk in future tense how you're going to analyze the data. Are you going to do it by hand? Are you going to evaluate the meeting? Are you going to use software? Are you going to use SPSS, for example? Or are you going to use NVivo or Atlas TI? Whatever you choose. Maybe you're going to do all your coding by hand. Whatever you choose, you have to disclose that. Okay? It's kind of like a recipe. Think of chapter 3 as a recipe for how you're going to do your study. How are you going to address the research questions, the hypothesis, the problem statement, and purpose? Again, it's tying in. Again, it might sound redundant, but you have to explain everything that you're going to do. A few more things. Limitations. Are there any limits to the data, their analysis, or the process of collecting them that may limit the validity of the study? For example, you can't control the response rates. You can't control the time, the scope. of this, that you have to do these in a certain number in a certain month, for example. Now, transitions and summary. This is important, that once you write chapter 3, you got to summarize key points that were covered, which is good for every chapter, but then you also indicate what might be covered in chapter 4. So you'll have your results and you'll allude to them, but you're going to discuss them further in chapter 4. In essence, chapter 3 is your recipe. Again, I use that word a lot, but it is a recipe of what you're going to do. And then you could say at the end, the findings from this data will be explored further in chapter 4. Okay, a good transition. Your writing style should be future tense. In your proposal, before you clear IRB, you have to write will. The data will, the participants will. Once you're done, then you change it all to past tense. Okay, do this in your method section, not the results, because the results, you can't do the results up in your proposal. No slang, euphemisms, or anthropomorphisms. Remember, academic writing. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, discussion, comment from your facilitator. But I do want to thank you for listening, and we'll see you at a future residency.